Hello, I'm Kaz Ward and I'm from Walk Ride. We're a group that campaigns for walking and riding to be the easier choice for people across Greater Manchester. And we're also supporting Manchester City Council with this School Street pilot. This session is going to take you through some of the things that you need to know about being a School Street Marshal, but it will also give you some background information to help you with any conversations that you might have with people on the street while you're volunteering. So let's start with a bit of background about school streets. So what is the problem? Well, we have a few stats here, and I think we've all seen scenes like this outside the school gates, and traffic is a big problem. And what we're seeing is that nearly 60% of primary school children are travelling to school by car, even though the majority of them only live 2 kilometres and less away. And only 45% of children are achieving their average necessity of 60 minutes of physical activity a day. On top of this, air quality is really poor outside of schools, and we all know how many parents sit there with their engines running and idling. And traffic is partly responsible for the emissions that are linked to around 1,200 premature deaths in Greater Manchester every year. And finally, we did a survey of parents last year, and many others have found similar things. That when we asked parents why they drive their children to school, the main reason they gave was because they just don't feel it's safe for them to walk or wheel. And ironically, they drive them. It's a vicious circle. And just to quickly show you this, so we're doing some traffic monitoring outside one of the schools on the pilot, Manley Park Primary. And you can easily see when the school holidays are, and the traffic decreases by around 50% during school holidays. So let's talk a little bit more about what a school street is. So a school street is a road outside of a school with a temporary legal restriction on motorised traffic using the road at school drop-off and pick-up times, but only when it's a school day and in term time. The restriction applies to school traffic, but also to any through traffic, but it might not apply to everyone, and there will be exempt vehicles such as those belonging to residents that are within the enclosure. The scheme helps children and families to walk, cycle or scoot to school safely, and it also helps to reduce the traffic in front of the school. Of course, reducing the traffic also helps to improve the air quality. But it should be noted that school streets are only one of the measures that we use to encourage parents to reduce the number of journeys to school by car and to walk or wheel instead, and we'll be touching on that at the end of this presentation. So all of you here will be volunteering for one of the schools that is part of the Transport for Greater Manchester School Streets pilot. Now, lots of schools in Greater Manchester have already held ad hoc or one-off school streets, but they are restricted with that in the number of times they're allowed to do it to 3 times a year. Now, there are some schools, although they're mainly in London, who have permanent school streets where the road is always closed at the beginning and end of every school day during term time. So Transport for Greater Manchester has received some funding that they're using to help around 40 schools across Greater Manchester, including 7 in Manchester, to have a school street every day for 6 months as part of a pilot. The schools in the scheme for Manchester are St Augustine's and Manchester Communication Academy in Harper Hay, St James's in Rusholme, St Paul's in Withington, Our Lady's and Manley Park in Whalley Range, and Brookburn in Chorlton. Now, if the pilot is successful, then for some or all of these school streets, they may become permanent as they are in London. So the funding from TfGM provides resources for the council and the school to run the school street, and they might use that for things like signage and barrier, perhaps for some council officer time. But it's important to note that there's no funding for the marshalling or for enforcement. So how are school streets enforced? Well, this is done by putting a legal order in place that your council uses to close the street to motorised traffic during certain times. And this will be shown on a sign at either end of your school street, like the one shown in the picture. Now, on occasions during your school street pilot, Greater Manchester Police may attend, and it's within their power to issue a penalty notice for any contraventions. On some days, the roads will also be physically closed by volunteers, and barriers will act as a deterrent to vehicles driving on the street. However, there is no other enforcement, such as cameras or automatic number plate recognition, when there are no marshals or barriers present. So let's now talk about the role of the marshal. So as I've said, on some days, the school street will be physically as well as legally closed, using bollards and barriers and staffed by volunteer marshals. Now, these volunteers may be teachers, they may be parents, they may be residents. Sometimes there might be someone who's part of a local group like Walk Ride. And in some cases, it might be even some of the older students from the school. So the role of the marshal is several things. So one is to manage the closure point where the barriers are to close both ends of the school street. One might be to manage vehicle access through the enclosure, and in that case to help walk the traffic through the site. It might be to talk to the public and tell them more about the school street and to explain what's going on. It might be to deal with any issues that arise, and also it might be to feedback on any observations that the marshal has during their shift. So as well as the marshals, there will usually be a lead marshal or a volunteer coordinator who organises the rota and should be there to manage the volunteers on the day. And there's two things to note here. First of all, you are not responsible for any traffic management outside of the enclosure, and you are also not responsible for supervision of children within or outside the enclosure. That remains the responsibility of their parents. So what can you expect on the day? Once you've signed up to be a volunteer, you will be given a start and an end time for your shift and a location for the meeting point, usually by your volunteer coordinator. You should always try and arrive at least 5 minutes before your shift starts so you can have time to get into position. On the day, there should also be a volunteer briefing given before you start your shift, where you will be provided with information specific to your school, your location, and the shift that you're on. So this might include information about how to communicate with your lead marshal or the school. It might have information about exemptions, those vehicles that are exempt to pass through the closure, or any diversions that are in place. It might give you information about how to deal with issues and any questions that might arise. And it might tell you how to communicate with parents and residents during the closure. You should be given a high-vis jacket to wear throughout your shift, and you should always keep this on until your shift is finished. Once the shift starts, a barrier will be put across the road at either end of the school street. Now, you may be given a role which might include moving those barriers. It might be managing the closure point, or it might be managing traffic within or leaving the enclosure. At the end of the shift, the barriers will be removed to reopen the road, and if required, they may be brought back to the school. So just to summarise your responsibility as a school street marshal, it's absolutely essential that you ensure the safety and well-being of everyone involved during the school street. And most importantly, that you personally stay safe, visible and alert. If it's your responsibility to manage a closure point, you should never leave it unattended. And most important as well, always stay polite and respectful whatever happens during your shift, because you are there to represent the school. So let's talk a little bit more about barriers. So the school may use two different sorts of barriers for their school street. One might be like the plastic road barriers shown in the top picture. Your school also may have been given lockable bollards. And you can see that in the picture below, where the bollards on the pavement can be unlocked and then locked into the centre of the road. The school will have been given keys for these, and if you have them, they should let you know if and how they should be used. So first of all, make sure that the barriers that you're carrying, if they're heavy or awkward, are carried correctly, and that you have a person at either end to lift and carry them if necessary. Make sure that you don't put the barriers across any access points or any drop pavements so that you don't obstruct any access for pushchairs, prams, or wheelchairs. If the barriers are lighter, on a windy day, make sure that they're still up and they haven't blown over. When putting out your barrier, always start by putting your closure from the left-hand side of the road. Now, this is the side of the road that you would drive on if you were driving into the street. Because if you start on the other side, you could end up getting vehicles trying to drive into the street whilst you're putting the barriers out. Once you've finished your school street and you're planning to reopen the road, start from the opposite side, from the right-hand side, to remove the barriers. When positioning your barrier in the road, make sure that it's in the middle, but if you can, make sure there's also a gap at the side or the centre so that cycles and scooters can still get through. You might want to use extra cones on the pavement, as drivers have been known to drive onto pavements to avoid barriers. We like these cone children that we've made, and if anyone would like the template, please let me know and I can provide those for you. Once your barrier is in place, you should position yourself behind it, within the enclosure, or to the side of it. Most important, that you should not be moved beyond the barrier into the road of any moving traffic. The school may have been given other signage that they can use during the school street to make your school street more visible. So this might include lamppost wraps, it might include cones which have wraps around them, or it might include plastic coated banners, which can be fixed to the barriers or perhaps to the school fences. So now let's talk a little bit about assisting drivers. Now, as I've mentioned, there will be some vehicles that are exempt from the closure, and these drivers will be allowed to drive within the enclosure. There may also be vehicles that need to leave the enclosure if they've been within there once you've started the school street. And it's a key part of your role to manage the traffic within the closure. Now, it will be up to your school to decide on exemptions, and these will be covered in your school volunteer briefing. Also, your school may give residents, or perhaps certain parents, exemption badges like that one shown to display. But it's important to say that residents do not need to have a badge to enter the enclosure. So typically, some examples of who might be exempt and who might not be. So those exempt vehicles, and these are vehicles that you must let through, might include emergency service vehicles on an emergency call. It might include vehicles registered to an address within the zone, i.e. those belonging to residents. It might include blue badge holders or parents with children with special needs who need to be able to get to the school gate to let their child in, and this should have been agreed in advance with the school. It might include carers for vulnerable residents who are visiting to provide care, or it might be utility providers on an emergency call. In terms of those vehicles that are not exempt and should generally not be allowed through, now that might include school staff, although your school may decide to let school staff through to the car park, and they should tell you whether this is the case. It will include parents. It might include delivery drivers, although use your discretion. If a driver needs to drop off something very heavy, then you might need to let them through. It might include tradespeople or visitors. It's also important to know about providers, the refuse collection that providers have been requested not to pass through during the school street time, so hopefully this should not be an issue for you. So if a driver does need to pass through the barrier, first of all, you need to talk to the driver and determine whether they are permitted access. Once you've spoken to them, if they are permitted, the barrier should be temporarily moved to one side to allow them to enter or exit the enclosure, and ask the driver to agree to keep at walking pace before you move the barrier. So that's around 5 miles per hour. Now, if there are a sufficient number of volunteers for someone to stay at the closure point, then one volunteer should walk in front of the car until they get to their destination. If you don't have enough volunteers, then perhaps think about using your voice or a whistle to make sure people know a driver is coming through. Also, while at your closure point, look out for any cars that need to leave the enclosure, and if possible, escort them out in the same way. If you speak to a driver and they're not permitted to go into the enclosure, then you should advise them on perhaps a diversion route, somewhere else where they might park, or the time that they can return and drive through. In terms of diversions, as part of the planning for a school street, your school will have had to consider suitable diversion roads for vehicles that are not permitted to go through the school street. Now, these options should be explained to you as part of your school's volunteer briefing, and that may be given to you in the form of a map like the one shown. So in this map here, we can see that red shows the closure for the school street and green shows the possible diversion routes for the drivers. Ask the driver where they're trying to get to, and if they need you to, explain where the diversions are for that. So let's talk about dealing with issues. Now, it's actually very rare that you will be faced with a difficult situation with a member of the public, either a driver or somebody walking. However, there are some simple and effective ways to deal with difficult situations. First of all, show respect to the person at all times, and remember that there may be other factors as to why they're feeling agitated. So, for example, perhaps they've been on a night shift and they're driving on their way home and tired, and they don't want to have to deal with a barrier and a conversation before they can get home to their bed. Remain polite and calm. Listen. Perhaps you can briefly reflect back their concerns and reassure them that they've been heard. Be friendly and never raise your voice. Try not to agree or disagree, and try and allow the person to talk. What's important is that you do not get into an argument with somebody, and remember that this is not personal. If you can, provide some options to help move the situation forward. So as mentioned, that might be somewhere else to park. It might be an alternative time to come back or a diversion they can take. Allow them to make the final choice. And if you can, report the conversation back to the lead marshal when the person has moved on. If the situation does escalate, so perhaps somebody attempts to drive through the closure point, it's really important that you, first of all, take immediate action to ensure your safety. Once you are safe, make others aware with your whistles or your voice, and they can also then take action to keep safe if possible. If you can, take a note of the vehicle number plate and you can report the incident. Try and call or signal to other volunteers at any point if you need their support and you feel uncomfortable in a situation. And of course, do not hesitate, if necessary, to contact 101 or 999 if you feel it's necessary. Remember, although these situations rarely happen, you should never fall into danger within this role, and it is always your safety that comes first. Another issue that might often happen outside the school or near the school is pavement parking, and I'm sure you've all come across that. If your school has a problem with dangerous or pavement parking, they may also have other signage that they can use to deter vehicles from parking, e.g. on corners or drop curbs. On occasions, the council may send traffic enforcement officers out and they can assist with bad parking. They can also issue penalty notices for parking on double yellow lines, but just be aware that they're not able to issue penalty notices for those that drive through the school street. If your school has provided them, volunteers might also want to hand out leaflets to drivers about pavement parking like the one shown, and you might want to make your own. So finally, let's talk about conversations on the street. So it may be that your school has given you some leaflets to give out to people, and also all residents and parents will have received notification about the school street before the pilot starts. But while you're volunteering, and if it's safe to do so, while you're visible and on the street, it's a really good opportunity for you to talk to parents and to residents about the reasons for a school street, especially those that have come by car. So during your shift, if it's safe to do so, we recommend that you do try and talk to parents and residents and give them some information, and if you can, get some feedback. Your school may have provided leaflets, but if they haven't, here's some information that will help you to have those conversations. So first of all, road danger reduction. Parents often say that they drive their children to school because they're worried about the danger of traffic creating, and this creates a vicious circle. School streets support families to switch to active travel to school, and they make it clear that motor vehicles have no place outside the school gates. Another benefit is the benefit to children's health. 33% of children in the UK are obese when they leave primary school, and that active journey to school can really contribute to combating this. And not only physical health, it can really help mental health. And it can lead to a more positive mood when the child arrives at school, with them feeling more relaxed to start the day, already focused and ready to learn. As well as the health benefits, the benefits of walking to school are being able to chat to friends and family on the way. And this is a really important part of a child's development. It's a great chance for them to practice their social skills. And walking and wheeling helps them to gain a better understanding of their geographical surroundings and their place within it. And also it helps to improve their road sense. And finally, as we've said, children are regularly exposed to high levels of pollution outside the school gates. And this can have an impact on the development of their lungs. It can exacerbate things like asthma, and it can also have an impact on their educational attainment. So by reducing traffic, we're really helping to clean up the air. And of course, it's good for climate change too. So during the pilot, we are going to be looking to measure some of the impact. And we will be carrying out some activities to monitor and evaluate. And the outcome of these activities will help us decide whether the school street can become permanent after the pilot ends. So within the school, schools will be regularly doing what's known as hands up counts. And this is where the teacher will ask the pupils to put up their hand and tell how they've travelled to school, and this will be recorded. About halfway through the pilot, there will also be a survey done with parents to see what they think about the school street. Outside of the school, we'll be measuring traffic volumes on the school street, but also on adjacent roads to check whether traffic has been displaced rather than being reduced. And there will also be some consultation activities with residents to see what they think about the school street and to give them a chance to say what they think in terms of positive or negative feedback. And finally, we will ask you as volunteers to feedback any useful observations or views that you collect during your shift. So as I said at the beginning, a school street is only one way to be able to encourage parents to walk to not drive their children to school. And there's lots of other things that your school can be doing. So some of the initiatives that I can mention here. So there's the Walk to School Challenge, which is an initiative run by Living Streets. And this is where each school monitors how their children in a particular class have got to school, and the class with the most children that have walked or wheeled to school might get a prize or appear on a leadership board, on a leaderboard. Another thing that Living Streets do is that they can come to the school and create a safe school route audit, which will help parents understand how they can walk their children safely to school. Your school may also offer cycle training. And another important thing is to make sure that it does have space for when children come in their wellies, or some storage for their bikes or scooters. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.